That's still going on.
Ready whenever you are.
Okay. Chucks, we're going to be going in a moment.
Okay, fine.
And my slides.
Yeah, let me just share right now.
Great. Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone, to this is the first of a series of events that's going to be marking SSRP Week, Sussex Sustainability Research Program. Getting a bit of feedback, Gary. Sussex Sustainability Research Program is launching our second phase of work. And so we're marking that occasion with an intensive series of discussions and debates and different sorts of audio-visual interactive events. And many of these are on our website, which I'll point out in a moment. But this is the first session, and we thought this was a good one to begin with. We're dealing with issues of the climate emergency and what climate action could be taken at a time of such urgent crisis. And we've got an esteemed panel, which I'll be introducing in a moment. But we wanted to, not advancing. Oh, the arrow keys. Thank you. So we wanted to mention some of the themes that we're addressing in Sussex Sustainability in the coming phase, and the activities that we'll be covering over this week will be touching on these various themes on sustainability frontiers, what we're calling South Coast sustainability, ecosystems, rights and justice, planetary health, and sustainable climate and food systems, which this topic fits under. You'll see the link there on that lower slide. That will take you to the events page for SSRP. You'll find out more about all of the activities that are programmed in for the week. There's still some space to sign up for several of these events, so you'd be more than welcome to join us. Many of them will be live. Some of them will also have a streamed element as well. But today we're going to be focusing in oops. Got a little problem while we're sorting that. On the COP27 session that you may have heard about in Egypt. It's going to be running for 2 weeks, and the focus is on addressing many of the issues that we'll be covering tonight. It's been described as a defining moment in the fight against climate change. And we know that at this point, science has established beyond a doubt that the window for action on addressing the climate emergency is closing rapidly. At the same time, this idea of a defining moment is something that not just this COP, but other conferences of the parties have been describing in recent years. But the question is it just a talk shop? We've heard some people have already describing it as a missed opportunity, or it may be, even before the delegates were coming together. So the question is this going to be a good COP or a bad COP? And so part of today's session is really thinking about that. Is it just a talk shop, or is it a defining moment for change? And we're hoping today that our panel we brought together can help us think about how we accelerate climate action, both from above and below. And with us here are the people you see on the screen. 3 of them are in front of you, along with myself. Our fourth, Chucks Okereke, who's professor of global climate and environmental governance and the director of the Center for Climate and Development at Alex Akume Federal University in Nigeria, is beaming in from Oxford today because of some of the problems with our rail strike that we've had. But Chuck's is with us online. I think you can see him in the corner of the screen. And what I'd like to do is maybe just give each of our panelists a minute to introduce themselves briefly before we get into the Q&A. Can I start with Chuck, who's in the corner there?
Thanks very much for having me here. My name is Professor Chuks Okereke, as has been introduced. I'm the director of the Center for Climate Change and Development at Alexis Weme Federal University. I was the coordinating lead author for IPCC AR6 Working Group 3, Introduction and Framing. And yeah, I also wear a lot of different hats trying to help various African governments to articulate a credible pathway to the greener economy. My specialism is green economy, political economy of climate governance, green transition, and climate justice. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chuck. Hand over to Helen Adams.
Hi,
You're going to need your...
Oh, sorry, thank you. This is like a microphone for a Barbie or a doll, it's tiny. Hello, everybody. I'm Helen Adams. I'm a senior lecturer at King's College London in the Geography Department. I work mainly on climate change adaptation and resilience. Also a lead author on AR6, Working Group 2 of the AR6 on mainly the sections around climate migration and climate conflict. I've also worked on the UK's climate change risk assessment about, not that migration should be factored as a risk, but it's their sort of people moving and how that would play into the UK's priorities. Yeah, and so in general, I work on climate change, migration and vulnerability.
Thank you. Over to Kayla.
My name is Kayla Enty. I'm the founder and chief executive of Brighton and Hove Energy Services Cooperative. It was formed in 2012, and we've been working for the last 10 years on rolling out clean energy projects. We've done 58 projects that save about 470 tons of carbon emissions every year, and we're looking to really start accelerating our work at scale.
And last and very definitely least, my name is Peter Newell. I'm a Professor of International Relations in Global Studies just across the way. Also used to work at IDS many years ago. Mainly work on climate mitigation and low carbon energy transitions. And I'm part of something called the Rapid Transition Alliance, which I'll be talking a bit about today. On the board of directors of Greenpeace and quite involved in the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative.
Thank you all. And my name is John Thompson. I'm Deputy Director of Sussex Sustainability and also a fellow here at IDS. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all this evening. And as I say, encourage you to participate in the week of events that are coming forward. Yeah. And so what we really want to talk about is not all the gloom and doom that you may have been hearing about in the news over the last few weeks in the build up to COP, but more about, well, what are the signs of hope? Where are we seeing positive change, both from above and below, that are leading to climate action at different levels? And so we've asked the panel, and we're going to invite you to be thinking about that as well. So where are these signs of hope that might show some progress? Where can we see action from above and below that may complement each other to drive transformative climate action? And we're going to start by looking at some of the big picture questions with a couple of our panelists to help us think about that action from above, and then turn to some more of the local dimensions of where we're seeing traction, where we're seeing change taking place. So let me bring Chuck's back, if we could. And I'll start with a question to Chuck's online to get us thinking about questions of finance, which have been a big talking area in the run-up to the COP, and was already a key area of concern in the previous COP in Glasgow. But both questions of finance from a mitigation angle and an adaptation perspective. But Chucks, what do you see as the debates about finance that are dominating the COP negotiations in Egypt? And what do you see, what hope do you have that there might be some breakthrough around that climate finance issue? And where can we break some of the deadlock which has prevented action from taking place so far?
Thanks very much. There are at least three key debates that are making the top news in Sharm el-Sheikh, or at least I will expect to make the top news. The first and the obvious one is the $100 billion per annum issue, where back 2009, rich countries promised that they will mobilize $100 billion per annum from 2020 to go to help poor countries to take climate action. This was one of the top issues in COP26 because despite the number of years that rich countries had to really keep this promise, they didn't manage to keep it, and they up to now haven't managed to keep the promise. And so with the COP holding in Africa, a lot of people are actually writing and saying, like, look, your payment is well overdue. And so the question is really about this mobilization of 100 billion. The second that is related is that a lot of poor countries are now saying that there has to be not just the increase in the envelope, but also that the issue of adaptation should get a lot more attention in terms of finance. Various analysis suggest a ratio of about 70 to 30% or 60 to 40% of money going to mitigation over adaptation. In one report, actually, it was put at 80% to 20%. And this is incredible if you consider that many poor countries have made adaptation their priority. A lot of money continue to chase mitigation for obvious reasons. This is the one that is more measurable and in some cases help to account for the action of rich countries. And then the third area where finance is going to figure is in the issue of reparation, if you like, or if you want to be a bit more diplomatic, the issue of loss and damage. Whether there will be a facility agreed to put money aside to help poor countries to take action and to cushion the catastrophic impact of climate change, which is already being felt across the length and breadth of poor countries. As I speak to you, over 1.3 million people have been displaced in Nigeria as a result of unprecedented flooding events. I think in total, since 2008 up to now, about 20 million people have been displaced across Africa. And so the issue of finance and loss and damage, finance and adaptation, and finance and mitigation, increasing the overall envelope will be significant finance questions that you can expect to see play out in Sharm el-Sheikh. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chucks. Following on that, I know Helen has focused a lot of her work on climate adaptation and resilience. What do you see as some of the key priorities and pathways, both from above and below, to building more climate resilient development and thinking about those adaptation issues that Chucks was referring to?
Thank you. And it's a lot building, what I was going to say is a lot building on Chuck's. It's a lot about the money when you talk about COPs, and it's a lot about this idea of loss and damage, which, as Chuck said, is contentious because high income countries don't like the idea of having to cough up for the impacts that they know they've caused, and no one can deny it in low income countries. Although people would say attribution isn't always that easy to do. So maybe you can't prove it that much, as an aside, but I won't go into that. I think I just wanted to have a few reflections. It's a big question, isn't it? And so I started with the bad and a couple of depressing things I've heard recently. I was recently talking to an adaptation person at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, and talking to them about, what are they working on? What's the current edge? And none of it was about justice, and none of it was about equity. And obviously anyone who studies adaptation resilience knows that it's fundamentally about, equity and justice. And so I found that it was really depressing. But then again, it was the OECD, right? So like the OECD is a group of rich countries. So, and this was one person, right? This isn't, don't quote me on this being like an organizational strategy, but like I found it a bit depressing. And then, stuff I read about, the other thing that's really depressing me at the moment is uninhabitability, and these billionaires making all these bunkers around the world so that they can go and hide out the apocalypse and leave the rest of us to suffer. And that uninhabitability is my pet adaptation hate at the moment, because one person's, if you think about most of us in the global north, most of the world is living in uninhabitable conditions right now, right? We wouldn't choose to live in it. We would consider those conditions uninhabitable now, right? So what does it mean for the planet to become uninhabitable anyway? And there's a lot of I've spent a lot of my life fighting physical scientists who love to make these maps of areas of the world that are going to become uninhabitable for humankind in the next X years. And so there's some of the things that sort of made me a bit sort of, and then I was listening to the radio this morning at COP coverage, and it was that question of, it was exactly what Chucks was talking about, should the global north, but maybe this is a positive because it was on Radio 5 Live, it was a question, should the global north pay, for the damage caused in the global south, low income countries? And I was a bit, oh God, are we still like, obviously, yes, there's that's the answer, yes. But actually, maybe that should go on my positive list because it was on the radio, and it was in a kind of general public debate, this idea of that, something has to shift. But to think about sort of the positives. So last year, I worked on COP26 for the government, and I was science engagement lead. So my job was really just engaging scientists, but I had more of an understanding of what the UK government was trying to do than I probably would have done usually. And I'm often not, when I'm not in government, I'm obviously usually not the biggest fan of what the government's doing, but I found myself quite easily able to defend what they were trying to do on adaptation and resilience. So, last year, the UK government really prioritized loss and damage. They really prioritized this idea of trying to move this funding forward, but they also really prioritized nature. And I think it was, it's one of the first times that nature and climate have really come together at a COP. And I think that's really huge, so that we can start to fight not just the impacts of climate on our lives, but the impact of biodiversity loss, soil degradation, all of it together, all these multiple crises together. So I suppose to think about the opportunities, the thing I always bang on about, one time I was talking to a woman before a podcast, and when they try and make you say it recorded and you can never quite say what you said when you were just chatting. But I basically said to her, like, climate change is the best opportunity we have to make a better world, right? And it sounds cheesy, but a lot of my work, and anybody involved in, any of you guys that are involved in vulnerability and adaptation, it's about fighting environmental determinism. And, as soon as you fight environmental determinism and actually reduce, and again, this is where I have a lot of fights with myself, but you reduce the actual impact of climate change versus societal impacts on people's lives, it's then quite a positive picture, right? Then we're in control, then we can change things. And that's when I get really bummed out by it all, that's where I go, that, I stop, I think, am I being environmentally deterministic? How much of this is climate change versus how much of this is actually just poverty, but poverty, inequality. And then when I meet the kind of end of the world people who just want to give up, I think, think if you were a slave back in America, 150 years ago, think if you're just, a person of color anywhere in the world, or a woman, or any of the fights, that people go through, they don't give up just because they haven't sort of won it. You keep fighting. And I think that's where I always go back, for something positive. And I'll leave it there.
Okay. Thank you. I think we'll hear more on some of those adaptation issues, I hope, in the course of our discussion, because as Chucks was saying, there is some momentum building, as you're describing. We already have a lot of ideas, solutions. It's a matter of actually putting these into practice and thinking about, well, how do we move in that direction? But let me kind of flip things around a little bit and look from below, starting at the end of the table with Peter. And we know that there have been some significant deadlocks and slow progress from above. We're now in the 27th COP. We're still, as Greta Thunberg was saying, there's a lot of blah, blah, blah. But there's also some action, some movement taking place at the same time. You've been doing a lot of work, both at the university and with partners in the Rapid Transition Alliance, asking questions about how do we get these rapid and just transitions from below in a variety of different sectors? And maybe you can elaborate a bit on where you've seen progress.
Great, thanks, John. So yeah, that's principally the hat I'll be wearing while I make these comments as part of the Rapid Transition Alliance. And so for those of you that have not heard of the Alliance, this is something I helped co-found back in 2018 with Andrew Sims from the New Weather Institute. And we've got a team based here at IDS, Sophie's here somewhere. And we've got around 150 organizations now around the world in Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe, and North America. And what we try to do is generate positive stories about the possibility of change. So in the face of some of this despair and the procrastination and intransigence at the international level, we try and generate positive stories of what we call evidence-based hope. So try and generate evidence about the possibility of change across many of the key sectors that we're dealing with when we think about climate change. So it's energy, it's housing, it's transport, it's food systems, it's finance. And we look at contemporary examples and historical examples to try and illustrate the possibility of change. And then, of course, use that as a tool for advocacy to call out inaction, to try and show that things are changing in different contexts. So let me just give very few examples. One from the energy system, because a lot of discussions around energy transitions, and I can see some colleagues from SPRU in the audience who work on these issues, it's often taken as given that energy transitions take decades, if not centuries, to roll out. And yet, of course, there are instances where they can speed up fairly dramatically. And if you think back to earlier this year, there was a lot of coverage around what was going on in Spain, for example. One of the largest solar farms in Europe has generated 1.5 million solar panels. This is the Francisco Pizarro solar farm, and it's generating enough energy to power 334,000 homes and prevent 150,000 tons of carbon entering the atmosphere every year. And so Spain is moving towards this quite ambitious target now of generating 75% of its electricity from renewable resources by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And this is in contrast, of course, to some of the responses we've had in the UK, where a refusal to move towards solar farms has, according to some estimates at least, added 100 million to energy bills that we're facing in this country. Of course, it's not all just about things going on in different parts of Europe or wealthier parts of the world. There's the case of solar home systems, which is documented on our website. So if you just Google Rapid Transition Alliance, you'll find all these stories. Another interesting case of how in Tanzania and Kenya in particular, a big rollout of solar home systems. So for example, in 1990, the number of solar home systems in Kenya was 5,000. By 2010, over 320,000 had been installed. China, often highlighted by many countries, including our own, as a laggard on climate action, installed more wind energy, 20 gigawatts of it in 1 year, than the UK has in total to date. So things can change, they can change rapidly, and we need to hang on to these stories and call out inaction when we're told that things can't change. Around housing, as we know, this building may be a good one, but a lot of our housing infrastructure in the global north is quite old, it's quite inefficient, it's quite leaky. And yet in the Netherlands, the Energiesprong system could retrofit a house just within 10 days and make it net zero carbon. Again, the Netherlands is an interesting example around heating. We're facing a cost of living crisis and a fuel poverty crisis in this country. And in the Netherlands, as late as 2018, gas was still heating 9 out of 10 homes. And yet the government decided to go gas-free, and the target they set for that was 2050. But according to some estimates, they may be able to halt domestic production of gas by this year. In Finland, big shifts around supply of heating, the use of district heating, etc. Over the course of 5 years in Denmark, for example, 1 million household heating systems were converted to more efficient district heating systems. Over the last year alone, we've seen a 28% increase in heat pump installations across the EU. So what I take from this is where there is a will, there's a way. And for me, what it shows is the importance of clearly strong, bold leadership by governments. We need governments to be setting ambitious targets, sending a clear direction to market actors about the way in which things are moving and which sort of innovations are going to be supported. It's about building public ownership and engagement, convening key actors, and using all the different levers of state power in terms of regulation and mobilizing finance and so on. And we are seeing some what we call first movers around supply side climate policy. And by that, I mean moves to keep fossil fuels in the ground. So it's bans, it's moratoria, policies that governments such as Ireland, Costa Rica, New Zealand, France and others have adopted to leave reserves of coal, oil or gas in the ground. And at the COP last year in Glasgow, we saw this Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance that was launched, led by Costa Rica and Denmark, and we've seen the Powering Past Coal Alliance. So there's plenty that bold leadership can do. I do think we need sometimes different entry points, which maybe goes back to your point. It's not always helpful to go with climate first as the key driver of action. I think increasingly it'll be around job security, health, well-being, many other things. But to go back maybe to Chuck's presentation, we do need to deal with the equity issues and to what Helen was just saying as well, perceptions of a fair share. And I think we're seeing that in this country at the moment. You know, the enormous profits that oil and gas companies have made could be used and redirected towards a massive home insulation program. So there needs to be a sense of us being in this together and relating, you know, overconsumption to people that are really struggling in the light of rising fuel prices. So I guess my final initial point then is around crises, because if you think about where the original New Deal emerged in the States, it was a post-war settlement. If you think about where the first Green New Deal ideas came about, it was in the wake of the 2007-2008 financial crisis. And of course, the conversations we're having now about how to build back better on the back of the pandemic also, I think, provide an opportunity to rethink some of these things.
Thank you, Peter. You're talking about crisis as opportunity, and something I think we can discuss further in the course of this session. But let me turn to Kayla and bring things closer to home here, because we're talking about a lot of big ideas, a lot of big issues out there. But of course, it's also happening here. We're being affected, but also some of us are responding. And Kayla, you're based in Brighton. Although we're talking about global challenges, your organization, the Brighton and Hove Energy Services Cooperative, BESCO, has been working for years to deliver more affordable, low carbon energy in the area. Maybe you can tell us more from your own experience about what you've been doing to bring about climate action from below.
Okay, so fossil fuels has made us really lazy. We can waste a lot of heat. Fossil fuels are extremely powerful. So if you compare what a heat pump can do compared to a gas boiler, you're talking about really having to improve the ability of your property to retain heat. And last week I was at a investment forum for clean technologies, and it was a bunch of venture capitalists who were looking for new companies to invest in. And what really I found quite remarkable is that the investment community is applying the same approach to investing in clean tech as it would in the fossil fuel economy. They're not, I think, a lot of the barriers to investment in these new technologies is due to a lack of understanding of what these technologies can actually do, and a lack of understanding about the environment and what needs to happen in order to accelerate the uptake of these technologies. For example, we're working on a lot of heat networks, and one at the Brighton seafront, for example. If you're going to do a heat network, that means that you're connecting maybe 500 properties to a renewable heat source like a heat pump. That means that you've got to get all of those people signed on to this program of agreeing to get their heat from a renewable source. Well, you're talking about people who are used to having their own gas boiler and having control over their own inefficient heating in many ways. So there is a huge sea change that has to happen in terms of our understanding of the kind of world that needs to be in place for us to have this new low carbon economy. And we're not seeing the regulation come through. So bankers are still allowed to have huge portfolios in fossil fuel industries. That's still allowed. That should absolutely be off the table. This thing about equity, it's so true. And there's never been a better chance than now, because energy prices have reached the point where they're very competitive with renewables. Probably you all know that onshore wind is the cheapest form of electricity. And yet here in the UK, we've been rejecting the construction of onshore wind farms. BESCO is working on the development of an onshore wind farm now. And just to get the paperwork in order to be able to file for planning permission takes almost a year. Then you've got to do the consultation. All of these processes take so long, and we just don't have the time to waste anymore. I don't think that people really understand the urgency, even today, or even since the summer when we had 41-degree temperature here in the UK. We're getting slapped in the face every day with the impacts of climate change. And yet people are not really understanding that we're required to change our mentality of how we have to approach this. So if we look at energy policy, our energy policy should be focused on the cheapest form of electricity, which is wind and solar. But we're looking at developing a 24 billion pound nuclear power plant in Sizewell that will take 10 years to build and takes so much cement up front that the carbon emissions are virtually up front loaded on nuclear power. You don't get the benefit until that plant is running. And yet we have no leadership in terms of energy policy and having a clear way forward. For us, we've suffered because of the change in policy and the regulatory environment. We saw the huge uptake in renewables when there was a feed-in tariff, for example, and then when they stopped the feed-in tariff, because prices had declined so massively for solar, it didn't impact us so much because our model is about the community owning the assets. So we raise money by people in the community, and then we invest in those assets and then manage the assets on behalf of the community. So we can overcome the financial barriers to constructing renewable energy assets. But then there needs to be a clear understanding that the investment needs to go into the grid. Our grid, certainly in the UK, hasn't had very much investment since 1920, when it was originally constructed. And the estimates are that it's going to cost 100 billion to get our grid to be able to accommodate the connection of the distributed energy assets that we need in order to have a low carbon future. And yet, when you saw Boris Johnson's 10-point energy strategy, nowhere was investment in the national grid mentioned. So it just goes to show how detached energy policy is from the reality of what actually has to happen. The same with, yes, we all have to insulate our homes. Unfortunately, because of shifts in government policy, there's hardly anyone left who actually will install the insulation. So we've done about 500 energy surveys recommending to people how they can improve their ability of their home to retain heat. And then people come back to us and say, okay, what can we do next? And we say, well, we can't really help you because there's nobody available who can actually do the work. So we have a very big crisis in terms of manpower to actually do the work. And so there needs to be a fundamental shift in policymaking in this country, and we need to stop having corporations have such a big influence on decisions that are made by central government, and get it more that it supports a fair and equitable society.
Maybe I could ask you to elaborate a little bit more about your social enterprise model that you're pursuing. You started to touch on that, but it's clearly a different sort of approach from the standard investor model that you were alluding to. And what makes that distinct? What are the unique attributes, and how is that being taken to scale both here in the Brighton area and elsewhere?
Okay, so my background is in finance and economics. I'm a qualified accountant, and I have a master's in environmental management. And the issue for me is that capitalism is destroying us. And it's really important to introduce other methods of running the economy. And so being a cooperative and proving that a cooperative model can work is super important to what we do. So the way the model works is that we raise money in the local community and we develop projects. So for example, we're developing a project with a wind farm that will generate the electricity to decarbonize oil boilers. So take out the oil boilers in the village, in the neighboring village, and put in heat pumps. Most of the time in British villages, these homes are extremely inefficient. So the first thing you got to do is improve those ability to retain the low temperature heat that comes out of a heat pump, and then put the heat pump in. And by using this local energy delivery model, you can actually offer through something called sleeving, where you enter into an agreement with an energy supplier to offer a lower price to that community, because you've got the economies of scale. So you can offer lower price electricity to help people run the heat pumps in their community, and you've decarbonized this community in a local model. And I see this model rolling out. It doesn't even have to be the UK. It can be anywhere in the world where you have a energy source, being sun. If you're in Africa, that makes the most sense. And with battery storage. So if we're looking at long-term battery storage, we're either looking at vanadium flow or really developing the prospects of hydrogen and really understanding how we can use hydrogen for energy storage. And we can use lithium ion now as a kind of an interim tool. But really, the future is about renewable energy and energy storage. And as far as I'm concerned, if we had local communities who were investing their money in their own network, getting a return from their investment, a reasonable return. I'm a big fan of Thomas Piketty, because he understands economics and he understands how we've been basically raping our economy to deliver higher than what is called a social return. And we should be delivering social returns and improving the well-being of our societies.
Thank you very much. I'm mindful of time and thinking there may be quite a few questions that our audience has both here in IDS and online. And I'm going to ask people if they would like to ask a question. We'll start with some of the people here at IDS to begin, but those of you who are online, please use the Q&A part of the Zoom link and add any questions, if you could, to that. And those of you in the audience, when you raise your hand, we call on you, if you could state your name, any kind of institutional affiliation, but try to keep your question quite short, precise, if you could. And then if you have it directed to one of the panelists, please let us know. Or if you'd like the panel in general to respond, that's fine as well. But we'll start with a select number of questions from the audience here. We can go over to the chat as well, the Q&A on Zoom get from our online audience a few points too. Gary's going to go around with a microphone. Any hands? We'd love to hear from you. Starting at the back as always.
I'll stand up so you can see me. Chris Todd, I'm Director at Transport Action Network. And the question I really want to ask is, it's great hearing all the positive stories, but it's no good doing the stuff to reduce emissions while we're still making things worse. And I'll point to road building and building more airports and air travel. So what can we do to stop making things worse?
Another comment, question from the audience here, right behind you, Gary.
Hi, I'm Steve Sorrell. I work at Sprue here on campus. It's a question about supply side climate policy, which was mentioned. Collaborate on what that means and what are the political prospects for that.
And then one down here.
Hello, Andrea Brock, lecturer in international relations. A lot of the kind of success stories you mentioned were basically within the kind of green capitalist framework. Peter already knows where I'm going with this. How do we actually break with that framework? How do we not just add on so-called good projects? I think I have to, I'm very critical of the turn to kind of industrial scale renewables without addressing some of the issues around mining, pollution, sacrifice zones linked to that. And I think lithium that you mentioned as a kind of solution for now is a really good example for that, right? Lithium has had devastating impacts for communities. So how can we break with those kinds of solutions and move towards something more like degrowth and like actually reducing, linked to that point over there, reducing our impacts?
A few small questions to begin. I think, Chucks, if you'd like to take any of the three that you've heard to start us off, and then we'll pass on to the rest of the panel here.
Sure. Before addressing one of the specific questions, I wanted to join issues a little bit with Pete. Not that he would disagree with me, but I think it's important to be clear about this. The point is not so much that nobody would disagree that it is, there are windows of opportunities in crisis. Okay. There was an opportunity in the 8 million to 11 million people that died during slave trade. Some people profited from that, right? Some people, big corporations, are profiting from the crisis that is happening in Ukraine. The poverty that is ravaging a lot of vulnerable countries has been caused by a particular global political economic system of which some people are profiting. So it's a crisis. So yes, it is possible to imagine opportunities in crisis, but really the question is opportunity for who? And this is where it gets interesting, because again, as you look at the question that the last person asked, you see that all the opportunities that are emerging are actually being captured by, if you think in state terms, in IR terms, you're being captured by the people that have actually caused, the states have actually caused the problem. If you think in capitalist terms, its cause is being captured again by the global capitalist elite that have caused this problem. So there is yet some kind of opportunity in crisis, but I think that what we need to do to make this, to stop making things worse is to stop kicking those who are already on the ground, to stop using the pretext of climate change to further impoverish those who are already poor, and to center justice and equity in the discussion. Because imagine a situation where we, magically generate nearly up to 100% of our renewable energy through renewable energy technology. But now Africa have to import all of those technologies in order to be carbon neutral. It is not a theoretical conjecture to imagine a much more impoverished but carbon-free Africa. This is clearly not the way to make things better. And so we need a better understanding of the link between sustainable development and climate action. And at the moment, the West is focusing so much on climate, carbon, and not linking properly carbon and sustainable development. And the way things are going are making things worse for those who are suffering already disproportionately from the impact of climate change. Africa holds just 1% of the global PV capacity, and yet physical analysis shows that up to 70% of renewable energies could be generated by Africa. And yet when you look at even the Kenyan example that Peter has cited, we see that a huge number, a huge percentage, nearly 100% or 90+% of all the technologies that have generated this extraordinary proliferation of PV in Kenya have been imported from abroad. How on earth do we expect Africa to be able to pay? We are making things work by further impoverishing Africa. Debt is increasing in many African countries that even sought to go renewable. They have had to do this on the back of increasing their debt burden. So unless we center justice and equity and have a stronger recognition of the link between sustainable development and climate action, and understand that climate is one of many others, the other 17 SDGs, one of the many other goals that nations pursue. If we continue along the lines of developing the technologies in the south, in the north, and pushing it to the south, and forcing them and telling them what to do and what not do, the pathway to go and not to go, denying them completely of sovereignty, of the ability to make their decision, and fostering on them even the good, so-called good renewable technologies, I think that in the end, we would have made these things worse. And we would have missed the opportunity that the second speaker said of using this as an opportunity to really address the more fundamental issues of global poverty and inequality.
Thank you very much for that impassioned response, Chucks. Last year, in fact, SSRP organized a conference, 3-day event on evidence for action, which was about aligning the Sustainable Development Goals and Paris commitments, very much interrogating that question about how we bring those two elements together in a concerted manner. Do you want to pick up any of the other points, or shall I pass on to the rest of the panel to touch on those?
Yes, the last point, I really very much agree with it. I think that is one way to begin to think about it. The time has come for the parts of the world that have really caused this problem to begin to seriously think about degrowing, to create the carbon and atmospheric space for the poor countries to increase their consumption and grow. And by the way, before somebody gives me any lecture, I was in a meeting 2 days ago, and somebody from a very well-renowned international organization said, yes, we need to rethink development, and Africa can teach us a lot of lessons about how we can do this by just consuming less energy and maybe remaining more rural. That's not the point. This is just a shorthand way of telling us that those who have caused the problem would like to retain their comfort, their riches, their overconsumption, their profligate lifestyle, and keep Africa in greater impoverishment. Africa needs to be given the opportunity and the sovereignty to make up their mind what type and model of development they want to pursue. It must not be at the expense of impoverishing Africa that we need to solve climate change.
Thank you. We need to make a distinction between survival emissions, essentially what you're talking about in the African context, versus luxury emissions, which are much of what we describe in some of our activities in the North. Let me ask the rest of the panel to address these 3 thorny questions from their various perspectives. maybe we can go down the line here and feel free to address one or all of them.
Thank you. I mean, Chuck's said better what I was trying to say, but I mean, that's it. And I think when it comes to these questions, if you don't embed what we do on climate in what we're doing for, for development in general, or for reducing poverty and increasing well-being, they got to come together. And so then it sort of seems to me it's just the continuing struggle that we've had for the past 400 years. And for me, I suppose I haven't lost a sense of urgency. That's the wrong way of saying it, but it's not going to happen quick, and it can't happen quick. And so it's just got to be part of the same struggle, and we keep struggling. And so that's why I don't like the bunkers. That's why I don't like uninhabitability. That's why I don't like end of the world, because it's just, things are going to get more and more unstable. But fundamentally, if we can sort out these issues that Chuck's just elaborated, we'll have a better world despite climate change. We'll just have to deal with a few extreme, we'll lose some of the coast, and there'll be some extreme weather, and like there'll be parts of the world we can't live in, but there'll be like 90% of the world will have a better life. And that's where I've come to. And so but it's not easy, is it? Just got to keep slogging away at these battles, and they're all incremental. But for example, talking about people, I forgot one of my depressing examples. I was at a meeting recently, and an old school adaptation person who'd been around since I started my career, he was like big then, he called the new IPCC Working Group 2 report woke. Wow. That's how because for the first time we had got, we'd really pushed to get the fact that vulnerability is driven by global inequality, and that is driven by colonial legacies. And that's in the Working Group 2 Summary for Policymakers. And it's really powerful because it's there now. The governments have agreed it. And so this to me was my positive thing, right? It's incremental, it's there. The IPCC is now talking about colonial legacies, which, every government in the world signed up to that. But this guy's like, oh, it's woke. And so that was a bit depressing, but actually it's not. It's a good thing. Like, he's going to die off. He's not going to have his career for much longer, and we can come forward. And so maybe not die off. I don't want him to die. He's a nice man, but maybe his time has come, if that's how he reads the IPCC report. So I think there are positives that are slowly happening as we all push forward. But that's what I'll say.
They would want to pick up the supply side policy issue, or the addressing the green capitalism theme.
Oh, yeah, I want to do all of those, but I'll try. I really want to come back on the justice thing that Chuck's raised, because it strikes me that that's absolutely crucial. And of course, well, maybe I can link that to the supply side issue, because in the campaign for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, those are the things we're talking about. It's like, the non-proliferation element is stopping the expansion of fossil fuels in the richer part of the world. So that comes back to the justice question. Obviously, it's not a demand that's being made of poorer countries. It's about those with the most historical responsibility, and, to use the UN language, the respective capabilities, those that can move away from fossil fuels, fastest and most easily. So supply side policies is policies which restrict the new generation and supply of an extraction of fossil fuels. So it's bans and moratoria. It can be fossil fuel subsidy removal, all those sorts of things. So it's trying to move the emphasis away from just talking about emissions. But clearly we need, to use the phrase that's often used, both sides of the scissors. You need to be reducing the demand and cutting the supply at the same time if we're going to get anywhere near a sort of 1.5 or 2 degree trajectory. So that's what supply side's about. But the just transition discussion, I think it has to be about centering questions of economic justice, which is what Chuck was getting at. And I think that the questions you raised there are really important, about intellectual property rights, about trade rules, about all of these sorts of things. So the governments have the policy space and the ability to generate the sorts of, lower carbon energy pathways of their choosing. What worries me, however, in the just transition debate is when you hear Exxon and Shell and BP talking about energy poverty as their new mission, as if further expansion of fossil fuels is going to benefit poorer people in many of the countries where they're wanting to expand them, when they've systematically failed to do that for many, many decades. So now invoking the energy poverty of poorer, marginalised people as an excuse to expand fossil fuels strikes me as very cruel and ironic. And to relate it back to the SDGs more broadly, there's no way we will meet many of the SDGs if we carry on expanding fossil fuels, because it's not just about climate, it is about health, it is about conflict, it is about all the other things. So that comes back to Andrea's point, which is, did we need to challenge the frame and move beyond it? Clearly, yes. And for me, again, that's about reducing demand. That's the only way you'll get it. It can't just be what I've called a plug and play approach, where you just say, okay, we're going to decarbonize and we're going to plug in renewables, but everything else stays the same. So around transport, it has to be pushing back against automobility. It has to be about traveling less, collective forms of transportation, etc. It can't be everything else stays the same. We just plug in a different set of technologies. That will be disastrous for a whole set of reasons. So you're absolutely right to say we need to rethink the economic model. It can't just be more of the same, but different technologies. Kayla?
Yeah, as somebody who doesn't even own a car, I find it really challenging that public transport, it seems to me the rail system is broken, the way that it incentivizes, the way that Network Rail works with the privatized rail companies is clearly broken. And the first thing that we should be doing, because transport is like 30% of our carbon emissions, is we should be addressing the attractiveness of taking the train instead of going in the car. And on a day like today, when there's rail strike, you're not helping the situation at all. In terms of air travel is less than 5% of carbon emissions. And from what I understand, there's new fuels that are being developed that are going to help at least with air travel. So in my mind, it really is the energy infrastructure and transport that are the two biggest issues that need to be addressed on international basis. If you look at shipping, it's not even included in as counting, and that is a big loophole that needs to be closed. And also, I forgot to mention pumped hydro. I really believe in pumped hydro as a source of energy storage, and that could be a way of looking at mitigating the use of lithium ion. Unfortunately, lithium ion is used for electric cars, and we don't really have a solution for that right now. So I do think that lithium will be what gas used to be called as the interim solution.
Thank you. I know we have quite a few students in our audience and some online as well. I'm just wondering if we can see some hands of students that we can get a few questions to start this next round. So let's make sure we hear from them.
Hi there, my name is Chloe. I'm a master's student here. It's actually for one person, but I can't remember your name, so I'm sort of going to just allude to what you do, the Brighton Collective one. I was just wondering, how do you convince the average person to hop on board with all these ideas that you are presenting? Because we're all here and we all care and we're going to dedicate our lives to this, but I can tell you now my mum isn't, and I don't know how you convince the average person.
Yeah. Okay, so
Let's hold on. We'll take a few more questions. There are other hands right here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is Roderick with the School of Global Studies. My question is directed to the issue of energy, because where I'm coming from, I was actually talking to somebody right now that they've been having a blackout for the past 2 days, which is challenging. And obviously the government always speaks of the coal reserves and these other sources that we have. Should we just let them as stranded assets? What can be done to assist? Because obviously we have the issue of energy deficit.
Question. Let's take this one over here.
Hi, I'm Nadia. I'm also a master's student here. My question is sort of directed at Kayla, because you mentioned hydrogen as a storage solution. To my knowledge, there's only one pilot plant, I think, in Germany that's producing green hydrogen. And so I was just wondering, how do we prevent, because there's a lot of hype around hydrogen as sort of being zero emission, that kind of thing, but gray hydrogen would release more emissions than just using fossil fuels. So how do we make sure that if we are using hydrogen, that it's really from renewable energies. Yeah.
I think we'll take one more at the very back on the left side there, Gary. Thank you. Sorry to keep you moving.
Hi, my name is Zainab. I'm from Nigeria. And my question is actually about, like what Chuks has said in terms of climate justice. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts and opinions are around marginalization, around gender transformative processes, because if we're talking about climate justice here and we're at the end of the day still marginalizing and subjugating groups that are already marginalized. We're talking about indigenous people, people that are actually at the forefront of these local communities. For instance, in Nigeria, where Chuk cited about the flooding, we have farmers that have actually lost their crops. We have people that don't have source of food. Energy is still like a luxury to them. We're talking about very basic needs. So where do their voices come to play in climate change conferences and climate change action in some of these negotiations, even in finances? How are they able to access finance? And if we're talking about justice, then where do we think their agency, how do we value it and really walk the talk?
Brilliant. We'll come back one more round. I think we'll get to you in a sec, but there's some fantastic questions there. Chucks, I'm going to put some of those back to you. Any that you'd like to respond to?
Sure. If we probably go in the reverse order, Zainab has made a very important point. Why often when we talk about climate justice, it is justice between states that tend to get most of the focus. It is also important to realize that there are many, many, many other victims of climate injustice that are not necessarily states. And even within states, we find, as Oxfam's research have shown, that the elite in the South actually account for as much carbon as some of the poor in the North. So we have this North in the South and South in the North. And it is ultimately those who have the dominance of power, capital, elite, both in the North and the South, that are, really pressing down on the poor. Niger Delta, for example, we know that they have been at the receiving end of many, many years of victimization, pollution, aggression, dehumanization. And it is important that we realize that these people need to be also considered as central in dealing with the issue of justice. And I think one of the things that we really need to do is to ensure that we are using the issue of climate change to strengthen transparency, accountability, and governance globally, but crucially in poor countries. I do not have any problem, for example, with asking poor countries to come up clearly with how they're going to make sure that any money they receive, for example, in exchange of debt forgiveness, that they have a clear, accountable and transparent framework to ensure that that money is spent in such a way that actually gets down to the communities that are at the front line. But when I spent the last 2 years elaborating on climate justice deal or swap, and the United States, when the Nigerian government took it to the US, and they almost just dismissed it, in a very patronizing way, and I think that really is very, very disheartening, because they fail to understand the way in which, especially in the wake of COVID, many African countries have been pushed further into poverty. Nigeria, have elaborated a big plan, a net zero plan, 2060. Despite being an oil producing country, I played a major part in doing that. We now have a climate change law And I wrote several parts of that law, including expecting or demanding that Nigeria government should come up with an annual carbon budget. But when you do all of this, so we have the energy transition plan that is valued at 1.9 trillion, about 410 billion extra per annum. And the vice president has really engaged in solid diplomacy to raise awareness of what we can do. But guess what? The much that we have got is a promise of about 3 billion. The CPI has said that African countries need about 221 billion per annum to deal with their climate change issue, to take action on their nationally determined contribution. At the moment, they are receiving just about 30 billion. So again, if the North is really serious about solving this problem, they know what to do. And so I am not happy with the level of hypocrisy and duplicity that the North has been showing towards Africa. Before COP26, they told Africa that gas does not qualify to be a transition gas. They stopped to fund gas investment in Africa. But after COP26 and with the war in Ukraine, we have delegation upon delegation visiting Africa, asking for gas investment. And as Pete was saying, not asking any question about how we could even use this gas as a bridge to, provide the necessary stability in transmission, etc., to scale up renewable. But their focus was really about how Africa could generate more gas and send it to Europe. And it's also happening with the sort of deal that have been signed with hydrogen in certain East African countries. We have had the opportunity of looking at the draft bill, and nothing again was said, the draft contract rather, and nothing again was said about the extent to which whatever renewable energy that is generated in Africa can be used to enhance energy security in Africa. And the focus is really about exporting energy to Europe and keeping Africa poor. And so to the question about should we leave the energy on the ground, it is a simplistic question. If the energy is generated, so the coal is dug up only to, or the gas is mined only to service Europe, I would say better leave it on the ground. But if there is a clear plan that we can use this gas or whatever fossil fuel that we have in a way that really enhances, deals with the issue of energy deficit, while also having clear plan to scale up renewable energy in the next 10, 15 years, I will say, let's go for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chucks. I'm going to move to the end of the table and work backwards this way. If I can hand over to Pete and address any of the questions that you heard from our students.
Okay, just very briefly. I mean, I think on the climate justice question, Chuck's is spot on there. We need to be really specific when we think about energy, and most resources really about for who and for what. Like what are the purposes those resources are being used for and by whom? And there is this huge issue of the polluter elite, right, in terms of historic responsibility and ongoing overuse of carbon budgets. So we need to start the conversation there, because there is a danger otherwise, as Chuck was saying, really, I think that there could be a double burden, that the poorest people suffer the worst impacts of climate change, having contributed little to the problem, but then are in the front line for some of the solutions being rolled out. But let me take the question on the voices of poorer and more marginalized people. That is one of my big concerns, I think, in the just transition debate, because people often make assumptions based on European experiences about the existence of a strong state, active civil society, well-mobilized and engaged trade unions. And those assumptions don't travel to many parts of the world, including other parts of Europe, in fact, about our ability to involve people actively in energy policy decision-making. And I think it's a huge challenge around opening up. So one challenge is around energy democracy, the sort of thing you're talking about, which is taking over control of how we produce energy, becoming prosumers, or however you want to talk about it. But another is how can we involve people more in the decisions which affect their lives? And I think there are ways of thinking that through in terms of energy innovations going forward, around budgeting, participatory budgeting. We've got lots of experience of that in other areas of work. Why can't we do the same around climate and energy? around co-production of energy regulation, and then also monitoring of projects and climate finance as well. So I think there is far more scope for civil society engagement on these issues, but my worry at the moment is that we're seeing a contraction of civic space in many parts of the world, and that has implications for energy transitions as it does for many other issues.
Kayla?
So in my mind, the way to address inequity in access to energy and to tackle fuel poverty is by the community owning and operating the assets in a social enterprise model, so that you're not looking at making a profit, and you're looking at providing clean energy to all of the people who live in that community. And it's using this model of raising the money, even if you were going to provide it, provide the same model, say in an African community, you might look at looking at how you could apply the money, as Chuck has suggested, to creating a model of equity where the people in communities all have access to the same clean energy, and in a distributed energy model. How do you convince people to adopt clean energies? That is really about economics. So one thing I've learned in the last 10 years that we've been trading is most people, 98% of people make economic decisions. They don't decide, unless they're really rich and they don't have to worry about spending money, they will weigh whether or not they're going to invest in renewables based on the price that you offer to them. And so now this is why it's a great opportunity for renewables, because you're generating your electricity basically for free once you get the assets up and running. And you can offer a competitive price on that electricity for each kilowatt hour, for each unit that you generate. And this is how real equity is created, because everybody has, there are people who can pay slightly more, and there are people who would need to be subsidized for their energy through some kind of program that wouldn't be too difficult to set up. I would like to ask something a little bit controversial, because you read a lot about this belt and road program where harbors are being built and large infrastructural projects. Wouldn't it be really interesting to look at transferring how that investment is spent to really looking at how you're going to help these nations improve their economic conditions?
Thank you. Over to Helen.
Thank you. I just want to come back on the, where's the agency of Indigenous people and women come in? And I think that's what taking a justice and equity approach means, that if we aren't, I was just reading Doreen Massey's book from '94, and there was a bit about the trade unions and why the trade unionism failed in the mid-20th century in Britain. And it was because they didn't, well, this isn't the reason why, but they didn't involve women. It wasn't a movement for women. And, she kind of mentioned in the book that, did all these women move to Manchester and go and work in a mill, because at least there they could get a job and be independent, and they weren't stuck at home listening to their trade union husband bang on all the time. And so, and obviously I'm into the trade unions and I believe in them, but they were doomed to fail because there were no women involved. And so it's the right question to ask. And I think, again, it comes down to the point I made at the beginning about joint struggles, about it's the same struggle that women have been struggling with for, centuries, if not millennia. But then I think there are these small steps. There are the kind of, if you think about how powerful, are they powerful? How vocal, at least, Indigenous groups are in the UNFCCC. They have to be heard in UNFCCC spaces. How much that's just, then when probably the high income countries, it's all just double speak, but they are listened to. They do have to have a platform there. You think about gender day at COPs. And I think I'll go back to it because I've just spent 3 years of my life on it. But the IPCC, we really pushed to get gender in. And for example, like, this is one of my one wins from the past 2 years, is that we managed to get gender equity as an adaptation to conflict, in the sense that your conflict happens in places that are poor, where there's lots of people and there's lots of inequality. And there's tons of evidence to suggest that if you involve women in peacemaking and peace building initiatives, they work better. So we were able to put that in. So instead of talking about climate and conflict as a thing you solve through war, we put climate as conflict as a thing you solve through gender equity, which I suppose a lot of people didn't like because they can't justify stuff with it. But so there are small wins, but it's the right question to keep asking. And I just think, you know, we are going to fail if we can't meet all these intersecting challenges together. You know, there's also interesting stuff now. I mean, maybe it's because of the bubble I'm in, but, you know, on environmentalism and racism and those two things coming together a lot more strongly. You know, even Greta Thunberg's talking about, you know, it being a problem of colonialism now and things like that. So there's movement forward, isn't there? But it's too slow, as we all know.
Thanks. We're coming closer to the end than I anticipated, so we're going to move ahead fairly quickly. There are quite a number of questions coming in online. I'll try to summarize a couple, bring some of them together, but they're addressing questions of again, vulnerable populations, people who could be seen as climate migrants, people who could be displaced by some of the disruptions caused by climate change. And how do we go about strengthening coordination and partnership across the climate, humanitarian, disaster risk reduction, emergency response actors to devise a more holistic response to climate-induced disasters? Helen, I know you've worked around this on the DRR side, but others may want to add as well. Let me pass back to you to start that.
I'm glad that person's not in the room, or they're not in the room. There isn't an answer to that, is there? In the sense that it's been the struggle of the development. I mean, you know, I mean, IDS, for God's sake, this is what you guys have been looking at. I just was listening to the radio. Oh God, now I'm going to forget. You know, where there was a terrorist attack at the concert, and they really criticised the emergency services. You know, even in the UK, we couldn't get the police and the fire brigade and, you know, the ambulances all working together. So I think it's a big question, how do you do it in humanitarian settings? I think in humanitarian settings, yeah, there's a big gap between how do you do humanitarian responses that feed into longer term resilience? How do you make sure you don't build in maladaptation? And I think the thing that comes out on top is locally driven responses, and where you give the survivors and the first responders, who are always the people there, you know, and I'm in IDS, there's no point, I'm preaching to the choir, but that's where you start to have more successful responses. But yeah, I mean, I've got no solution to that one. Maybe Chuck's has.
I'm afraid we're running short but Chucks, do you want to respond to that?
Helen provided a very clear answer. I've actually, I have an op-ed, which I just finished writing before I joined this meeting on climate, conflict and migration. If it is accepted, perhaps it'll be published tomorrow. But the key point I was making is that this remains a blind spot in climate negotiation. And I'm happy to have met Helen here because I'll be knocking her door. But this is a blind spot. And what I have said in that op-ed is that 3 things need to happen in COP27 in Egypt to center the nexus between climate conflict and migration. And number one, there has to be a high-level meeting on climate migration and conflict. It should lead to a decision in the Sharm el-Sheikh decision. It has to be mentioned, and a work program between the UNFCCC and the International Organization on Migration need to be set up to begin to look at this issue. We don't even have the word climate refugees in any climate, the UNFCCC climate document. They've blocked this, the usage of this word. Of course, we recognize that it's a very complex intersection between other dynamics, but all the research points to the fact that climate change exerts a major, in some cases, dominant influence in the conflict and migration that is pushing nearly now about 20 million people around internally and externally in Africa. So I think it's a major issue, it's a blind spot, and the likes of Helen, who actually are more vast than myself, need to be calling up this issue, because I have joined the discussion in this area.
Thank you. I'm going to now take us on a little thought experiment. We're going to move to the year 2030. Imagine it's November 2030, and we're all sitting here. We're all celebrating that this is now the end of the Paris Agreement timeline, 2030. Similarly, the 2030 agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's a big year, and we're having the latest COP, and that discussion is going on as we speak. So I'm going to ask our panel to imagine we're sitting there in 2030, looking back to this past decade, thinking about were some of those ambitious goals that we've set for ourselves, the global community, have some of those been realized? If not, what are some of the obstacles? But more importantly, what are some of the critical elements of success that brought about that rapid and just action that we're calling for here today? I think we'll start with Kayla. And if no, you prefer, I'll start with Helen then at this end of the table and work that way.
Hang on, I went right down imagining myself. Are we imagining it went well? And how do we get there?
It's up to you to talk about how you envisage 2030. We're here to talk about evidence of hope.
Okay.
Of positive change, but there could be some obstacles along the way.
Oh, I'll tell you what I wrote down when you first started talking, and then I probably stopped listening and just started writing this down. I put electrification, cancellation of debt, and renaturing. And they were the things that if it were in 2030, and I think there may be things that they could be, they're on the agenda now, they're being spoken about now, they're on the potential to be accelerating and exponential in their acceleration, that I think you could probably see, widespread electrification of energy systems, these kind of reparations coming through. Chuck's talked about it, kind of cancelling debt. You know, think about Pakistan, it's not aid they need, it's kind of debt relief. And then I think this creating space for nature. So Pete and I were talking, not nature-based solutions necessarily, but rewilding, maybe not even rewilding, that's got its own issues, but like prioritizing nature. And I think they're things that we could be on a good path for by 2030. But I don't think the negotiations, they haven't done much in the past 27 years, 26 years, have they? So they're probably not going to have done much by 2030, but maybe I shouldn't be negative about that. But I do think outside of that, these are things that could happen.
Great. Maybe I'll pass to Chuck's and get a response. It's 2030.
Well, if I'm honest, one of the things that really frightens me sometimes that you could close your eyes and open it, and you wouldn't be sure whether you are in Sharm el-Sheikh, 2002, or whether you were in The Hague, 2006, or even in Kyoto, 1997. There is a sort of repetition going round and round the mountain that has been happening. And the reason is really because we're trying to find a solution that allows the capitalists to capture value. Why? To try to solve the problem within the dominant economic and international relations model that we have. And so by 2030, you see that more European countries are able now to wean themselves off gas and off fossil fuel. Africa remains extremely very poor, and they will actually be come under greater pressure to leave their own resources on the ground to contribute to more climate action. And then we are starting to talk about the next Sustainable Development Goals, which will deliver little or nothing by 2050.
We're looking for evidence of hope.
I have little for you. Like the Churchill you quoted. All I have for you is sweat, toil, and blood.
Oh, all right. Shall I pass to Pete at the end?
No pressure then. Unfortunately, I think overall my view would be, honest answer would also be quite negative, like barring a huge reorientation of the economy. And that's not because we don't have the technologies and the means and and there's more than enough money flushing around the world economy, but it's just directed towards the wrong things. But if you're pushing me to say, what would it take to get to a more positive scenario? Clearly, it's going to be about bold leadership by key economies, and there's a geopolitical dimension to that we're all too aware of. Social movement pressure is something we haven't mentioned enough probably so far this evening. It's going to be around the direct action, the resistance to new infrastructures and pipelines and so on. But it's also going to be around advocacy around finance and divestment and so on, protection of land rights, human rights. These are some of the sort of key frontline struggles that aren't really climate struggles, but they have massive implications for tackling climate and sustainability. Obviously, we're going to need new forms of innovation and all of that, but also what transition people often call ex-novation, which is like banning things and undoing certain technologies or ways of making products that are so destructive. And for me, it's really like redirecting the finance. Maybe this is coming back to Kayla's point here, because we still spend $11 million every single minute on fossil fuel subsidies. Like, imagine if we did redirect that to something more useful and supporting people to access, renewable energies, etc., or redirected some of the vast arms expenditure. So redirection of finance will obviously be crucial to this. But ultimately, and I guess this is the theme of our conversation this evening, it is about shifts in political power, right? Like, if incumbents and powerful elites, as Chuck was saying, get to keep control of this, then we'll still be having exactly the same conversation in another 10 years. So I think we need shifts on all of those things. And just sort of one other example of sort of cognitive dissonance, if you like, and this comes back to some, maybe on the radio or saw it in the newspapers, it was sort of 3 headlines, one after another. The first one was the emissions gap report saying we're drifting towards a world of 2.3 degrees. The second one was saying the Prime Minister's not even going to bother attending COP. Now he's changed his mind, gladly. And the third one was about record profits for Shell and BP. But no one was making the connections between those things. The fact they're allowed to make these record profits and the government's doing nothing and can't even be bothered to attend the climate summit. And hey, guess what? We're heading towards 2.5 degrees. So that's, the work is to sort of draw the connections between these things, because it is a relational thing. I think that's one thing we've been saying. It's relational north-south, it's relational around gender, race and class, and that has to be part of the conversation, I think, going forward.
Brilliant, thank you. Kayla.
I'll just, so my dream is that there starts to be a big lawsuits against the oil companies for having created this situation around the world. And Exxon and Chevron and all these large companies are made to pay. And we use that money to invest in our low carbon future. That would be a dream that could perhaps actually happen. And the other dream I have is that we get out there and we start saying, we're not going to take this anymore. We're not going to allow fossil fuels to be subsidized at 8 times the amount that renewables are subsidized. And all the other unfairnesses that happen. We'll switch our bank accounts. We'll only bank with banks that are being more responsible about how they spend our money. And we will take as much action as we possibly can, considering that we are fairly limited in what we can do. What is it, like 100 corporations create 70% of the impact on the climate. So we really have to start attacking that.
Thank you. Given the time, we're going to have to bring things to a close. So I just want to, first of all, say that it's not all gloom and doom, even though we did hear a certain amount of that. There is still some evidence of hope that we heard from the local level, right here in Brighton, all the way to some of the international action that's being taken. So let's hope we can build on that in the coming days and months ahead. But I'd like to stop here now and say thank you to our 4 discussants, to Chucks, Helen, Kayla, and Peter for their contributions, and to give them a round of applause, please. I'd also like to thank Juliet Richardson, Carlos Miret Fernandez in the SSRP Secretariat team, and here Gary Edwards and Erin McDermott and our IDS communications team for all their able assistance in organizing this event and live streaming. It's going to be available on YouTube afterwards. Finally, I'd like to thank both our online audience and the audience here today for your fantastic contributions. Those of you who are here with us now, we'd like to welcome you to an after panel, some nibbles and drinks outside this room. We can carry on the discussion about how we change the world and bring about positive climate action. So thank you to all, and please continue to join us for the rest of the week for the SSRP events. They'll be going on till Friday. Check our website. Thank you very much.